You think a couple of spreadsheets make you a CEO? Ray's sneer cut through the air like a knife. I cringed, trying to soothe Benny's wailing cries as his tiny body squirmed in my arms. My husband's words stung, but I forced a tight-lipped smile. It's just freelance work, honey. You know that. Ray scoffed, his eyes rolling as he turned away. Right. Playing pretend while the rest of us handle the real work. I bit my tongue, rocking Benny gently until his cries subsided. This wasn't the first time Ray had belittled my career change, but each jab chipped away at my confidence a little more. After Benny's birth, I'd transitioned from my finance manager role to freelance consulting, thinking it would give me more flexibility. But Ray and his parents, who we'd moved in with to save money, treated my work like a cute little hobby. Marla, dear, could you help me with lunch? Helen's voice drifted in from the kitchen, her tone saccharine but laced with expectation. I suppressed a sigh, shifting Benny to my hip as I headed towards her voice. Ray's mother had been increasingly demanding of my time and energy, as if my income didn't already cover most of our living expenses. But Ray would never admit that. He loved playing the provider, even as he secretly drained our joint savings without my knowledge. I plastered on a smile as I entered the kitchen. Of course, Helen. What can I do? Her eyes narrowed, zeroing in on Benny. Well, for starters, you can stop coddling that child. He'll never learn independence. I opened my mouth, but the retort died on my lips. Arguing never ended well. As I shifted Benny to his playpen, my laptop caught my eye, a reminder of the work awaiting me amidst the constant demands and criticisms. For now, I could only grit my teeth and power through, one spreadsheet at a time. The shrill ringing of the doorbell jolted me from my work. I glanced at the clock, 3 p.m. on a Tuesday, which could only mean one thing. I'll get it, Helen called out, her tone laced with false sweetness. Seconds later, her voice rang out again. Marla, get in here. I sighed, reluctantly leaving my laptop behind as I made my way to the living room. Helen stood with her hands on her hips, eyes narrowed at me. Yes, Helen? I fought to keep my tone even. You can't honestly expect me to handle this housework all by myself, she tutted, waving a dismissive hand. We need your help. I opened my mouth to protest, but the words died in my throat. Arguing would only prolong the inevitable lecture. Of course, I conceded through gritted teeth. Just give me a minute to save my files. Oh, pish-posh, Helen scoffed. That silly little project can wait. This is a real job that needs doing. She shoved a feather duster into my hands, leaving me no choice but to comply or risk another tongue-lashing. For the next 2 hours, I dusted, vacuumed, and scrubbed every inch of the living space, my freelance work a distant afterthought. All the while, Helen hovered nearby, critiquing my every move. No, you're doing it all wrong, she'd snatching the cleaning supplies from my hands to demonstrate her proper technique. By the time Ray returned home from the office, I was thoroughly exhausted and utterly defeated. There's my hard-working wife, he greeted me with a patronizing grin, ruffling my hair like I was a child. I managed a weak smile, my jaw clenched to keep the biting retort at bay. It wasn't until later that night, after reviewing my invoices and payments, that the truth finally hit me. My freelance income easily covered our rent, utilities, and most of our living expenses. Ray's providing was little more than a facade, one he'd been propagating by siphoning money from our joint accounts into a separate slush fund. As I stared at the damning numbers, my vision blurred with angry tears. All this time, I'd been treated like a failure, when in reality, it was my husband who was the fraud. The realization left me reeling, but also kindled a newfound sense of determination. If Ray wanted to play financial games, then I'd have to start playing by his rules too. Starting tonight, I vowed, keeping a separate ledger of my own, one that would ensure I always held the upper hand. The air was thick with tension as we gathered around the dinner table for Benny's 5th birthday. Helen had insisted on cooking an elaborate meal, despite my protests that Benny would be happier with pizza and cake. A home-cooked feast is a family tradition, she'd snapped, leaving no room for argument. As we settled in our seats, Benny's eyes lit up at the sight of his favorite chocolate cake, complete with 5 candles. Make a wish, sweetie, I encouraged with a smile, trying to inject some levity into the stifling atmosphere. Before Benny could respond, Helen cut in with a disapproving cluck of her tongue. He's far too old for such childish nonsense, Marla. It's high time you started parenting him properly. I felt the heat rising in my cheeks, but bit back the retort burning on my lips. Arguing would only make things worse. Ray, ever the oblivious bystander, simply shrugged and dug into his plate. Mom knows best, he mumbled around a mouthful of food. The meal crawled by in agonizing silence, punctuated only by Helen's periodic critiques of my mothering skills and life choices. You really ought to find a proper job, dear. This little freelancing hobby of yours is hardly setting a good example for Benny. I clenched my fists beneath the table, nails digging into my palms as I struggled to maintain my composure. And speaking of examples, Helen continued, her gaze sweeping over me with disdain, when was the last time you bothered with your appearance? You're starting to look quite frumpy. The words stung like a slap to the face, and I felt hot tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. Before I could respond, Ray cut in with a dismissive chuckle. "Aw, lay off her, Mom. Marla's just trying her best." His attempt at defending me only twisted the knife deeper. I wasn't a child needing coddling. I was his wife, his partner, being systematically torn down in our own home. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced smiles and polite nods as I struggled to hold myself together. It wasn't until I was alone in the bathroom, gripping the edges of the sink, that I finally allowed the anguished sobs to escape. As the tears streamed down my cheeks, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirror, a hollow-eyed, exhausted shell of the confident woman I'd once been. In that moment, a painful realization crystallized. This toxic environment was slowly eroding my sense of self-worth, piece by piece. I had to find a way out, I resolved, swiping angrily at the tears, for Benny's sake, if not my own. But navigating an escape from Ray's web of control and deceit would take careful planning and an unshakable resolve that I wasn't sure I possessed. Not yet, at least. But as I stared into the mirror, my gaze hardening with newfound determination, I vowed that I would find that strength, no matter what it took. I hovered outside the den, my heart pounding as I strained to make out the hushed voices drifting through the cracked door. It was late, well past midnight, and I should have been asleep, but something had drawn me here instead. "Can't keep doing this, Ray," a woman's voice murmured, laced with exasperation. "She's going to find out eventually." My breath caught in my throat as I recognized the throaty tone. Kara, one of Ray's coworkers. "She's too caught up in her little fantasy world to notice." Ray scoffed, his words like a punch to the gut. "I've got everything under control." Under control? My mind raced, trying to make sense of their cryptic conversation. What was he hiding from me? "You're funneling money into a separate account," Kara persisted, her voice edged with disapproval. "That's fraud, Ray, not to mention the fact that you're lying to your wife about." Her voice trailed off, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Ray was lying to me about something big. A cold knot of dread formed in the pit of my stomach as the pieces began to fall into place. The secret accounts, the late nights at the office, the hushed phone calls. Was he having an affair? The thought was almost too painful to bear, but I knew in that moment that I couldn't ignore the glaring truth any longer. I had to find out what was really going on. Over the next few days, I made it my mission to uncover every last detail of Ray's betrayal. I pored over bank statements, combed through his emails and browser history, and even went so far as to hire a private investigator to trail his movements. With each new revelation, the picture became clearer and more damning. Not only was Ray having an affair with Kara, but he'd been systematically draining our joint finances, squirreling away a sizable nest egg in preparation to leave me. The final straw came when I stumbled across a legal document outlining his plans to file for sole custody of Benny, using his financial control as leverage to paint me as an unfit mother. As I read those cold, calculated words, something inside me finally snapped. The fear, the self-doubt, the constant second-guessing, it all evaporated in an instant, replaced by a blazing fury. I was done being the victim. It was time to fight back. That night, as Ray slept beside me, oblivious to the storm brewing, I began meticulously compiling every shred of evidence I'd gathered, every canceled check, every damning email, every incriminating photograph. By morning's light, I would have an airtight case to destroy his carefully constructed web of lies, and when I did, I vowed, glaring at his peacefully slumbering form, there would be no mercy. Ray was about to learn that hell hath no fury like a woman scorned and betrayed. The manila folder felt heavy in my hands, weighed down by the damning evidence it contained. Evidence of Ray's betrayal, his lies, his utter disregard for me and our family. I took a steadying breath, squaring my shoulders as I strode into the living room where Ray sat, obliviously watching TV. "We need to talk," I stated, my voice surprisingly calm despite the storm raging inside me. He glanced up, brow furrowed in confusion. "What's up, babe?" The endearment made my skin crawl, but I pressed on. "I know about the affair, Ray, and the money you've been stealing from our accounts." His face paled, eyes widening in something akin to fear, an expression I'd never seen from him before. "What are you talking about?" Rather than answering, I tossed the folder onto the coffee table, its contents spilling out in a damning array of bank statements, emails, and photographs. "This is what I'm talking about," I said coolly, crossing my arms over my chest. "The proof of your lies and betrayal." For a long moment he simply gaped at the incriminating evidence, mouth working soundlessly. Then, like a switch being flipped, his expression hardened into a sneer. "You've been spying on me?" he accused, voice dripping with disdain. "Jesus, Marla, I knew you were pathetic, but I didn't think you'd stoop this low." His words lashed out like a physical blow, but I refused to flinch. Not this time. "Save it, Ray," I shot back, my hands balling into fists at my sides. "I know all about your little scheme, how you were planning to leave me and take Benny, using your financial control to paint me as an unfit mother." A flicker of surprise crossed his face, quickly masked by a derisive snort. "So what if I was? You're barely even a wife, let alone a decent mother, always working on those stupid spreadsheets instead of taking care of your family." White-hot fury blazed through me at his callous dismissal of my career, my worth. But even worse was the realization that this blatant disrespect and emotional manipulation had been the norm in our marriage for far too long. No more. "Get out," I said, the words clipped and laced with venom. Ray blinked, clearly taken aback. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," I repeated, lifting my chin defiantly. "Get your shit and get out of my house. This marriage is over." For a beat, he seemed too stunned to react. Then his expression contorted into an ugly snarl. "Your house?" he sneered. "In case you've forgotten, I'm the one who's been stealing from our accounts to fund your little slush fund?" I cut him off, my voice rising in a burst of vindicated rage. "Who's been lying and cheating and manipulating me at every turn?" I stalked towards him, eyes blazing. "Newsflash, Ray, that money you've been squirreling away, the down payment for this place, it all came from my freelance income that you mocked so freely." Watching the realization wash over his features, I felt a surge of vicious satisfaction. The tables had well and truly turned. "So get out," I repeated, jabbing a finger towards the door, "before I call the police and have you removed for trespassing on my property." For once, Ray seemed utterly speechless, his mouth working soundlessly as the fight drained from his eyes. In that moment, as I watched my husband, my tormentor, deflate into a sullen, defeated heap, I knew I'd finally broken free from his toxic chains. The storm had passed, and I was still standing, battered but unbroken. And as I surveyed the wreckage of our marriage, a strange sense of peace washed over me. It was finally over. I'd survived the tempest, and I would be damned if I ever allowed another man to make me feel so small again. The air was thick with tension as I faced Ray's parents in their den, the folder of evidence clutched tightly in my hands. After kicking Ray out, I knew I had to strike while the iron was hot. "What's this all about, dear?" Helen asked, her tone simpering but laced with suspicion. I took a deep breath, steadying my nerves. "It's about your son and the lies he's been telling us." Steve frowned, exchanging a look with his wife. "Now, Marla, I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation for whatever this is about." "Is there?" I challenged, tossing the folder onto the coffee table. "Take a look for yourselves." They leafed through the contents in silence, the bank statements, emails, photos, all painting a damning picture of Ray's deceit and infidelity. As the truth sank in, Helen's face contorted with rage. "That ungrateful little worm," she spat. "How dare he betray this family like that?" I couldn't help but feel a twinge of satisfaction at her outrage. After years of belittling and criticism, it was almost vindicating to see the tables turned. You knew about his affairs, his secret accounts? Steve asked, dumbfounded. I shook my head. Not until recently. Turns out Ray's been funneling money from our joint accounts into a separate slush fund, all while cheating on me with some woman from his office. That lying, sniveling... Helen's rant dissolved into a string of curses, her face mottled with fury. Steve simply stared at me, agape. Marla, we had no idea. You have to believe us. For the first time, I detected a glimmer of sincerity in his voice, a recognition of how badly they'd misjudged the situation. The years of overlooking Ray's misdeeds while treating me like a burden. I schooled my features into a mask of cool indifference. Well, now you know. I'm filing for divorce first thing tomorrow and going after full custody of Benny. Helen's eyes widened in alarm. Now, let's not be hasty, dear. Ray's still your husband, the father of your child. Surely we can work through this as a family. I barked out a harsh laugh. A family? You two have done nothing but undermine me and treat me like a failure since the day we moved in here, all while your precious son was lying and stealing from me. Shaking my head in disgust, I turned to leave. No, this marriage is over. And if Ray tries to fight me on custody, I'll make sure the court sees every last piece of evidence of what a lying, cheating scumbag he really is. Steve opened his mouth, perhaps to argue, but I cut him off with a dismissive wave. Save it. I'm done being the fool you always thought I was. From now on, I'm playing by my own rules. As I strode out, my head held high, I felt an unfamiliar sense of power coursing through me. For years, I'd allowed myself to be cowed and controlled, first by Ray, then by his overbearing parents. But not anymore. The shackles were off, the power dynamic irrevocably shattered. Ray's world was about to come crashing down around him, I vowed, allowing myself a vindicated smirk. Just like he'd brought ruin upon our marriage. And this time, there would be no absolution, no chance for his redemption in my eyes. He'd made his bed, and now he could lie in it, alone and disgraced, just as he deserved. The slam of the courtroom door punctuated my exit, the sound reverberating through the tense silence like a judge's gavel. I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile as I strode down the marbled hallway, Ray's stunned face etched into my mind. Filing for divorce had been the easy part. Gathering evidence of his infidelity and financial crimes painted him as the clear villain. But custody of Benny? That had required a defter touch. I'd come armed with a meticulous paper trail, documenting how my freelance income had not only covered our living expenses, but also the down payment on the duplex Ray's parents owned. With cold, hard facts, I systematically dismantled his claims of being the family's sole provider. The final blow had been presenting proof of his plans to take Benny and use his financial status to manipulate the custody arrangement. As the words left my mouth, I saw the blood drain from Ray's face, that cocky arrogance evaporating in an instant. He knew, in that moment, that he'd lost, that I'd uncovered every last secret, every sordid detail of his betrayal, and wielded it like a blade to cut him down. By the time the judge rendered her decision, it was almost anticlimactic. Full custody to me with strict limitations on Ray's visitation rights pending review, a freeze on all our joint assets until the financial crimes could be properly investigated. And then, the piece de resistance. My legal claim to the duplex, built on the foundation of my income that Ray had so arrogantly dismissed as playing pretend. I could hardly contain my glee as the judge ruled in my favor, awarding me not just the property, but the right to initiate its sale and division of assets. A fair judgment, she declared, considering the extent of Ray's deceit. By the time I exited that courtroom, flushed with victory, I was already weighing my options for the next chapter. A fresh start, just me and Benny, far away from the toxic tether of Ray and his enablers. Perhaps a cozy little house, I mused, reveling in the fantasy. A place where I could finally spread my wings as a mother and a professional without constant criticism and undermining. Benny would thrive in a stable, loving environment unburdened by his father's failings, and Ray, well, he could keep wallowing in the ruins of his shattered life, I decided with a twist of dark satisfaction. Let him suffer the consequences of his entitlement and arrogance. My path was clear now, brilliant and unobstructed by his looming shadow. For the first time in years, I could breathe freely, my lungs filling with the invigorating air of liberation. As I climbed into my car and pulled away from the courthouse, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes sparkled with renewed determination. My shoulders straightened with a sense of regained power. Gone was the shrinking Violet who'd allowed herself to be cowed and controlled. In her place stood a phoenix reborn from the ashes of betrayal, stronger, wiser, and utterly unstoppable in the pursuit of the life she deserved. This was only the beginning, I vowed, hands tightening on the steering wheel. The first delicious taste of the reckoning still to come, and God help anyone who dared stand in my way. The realtor's eyes widened as I named my price for the duplex. "Are you certain, Miss Shore? That's quite a significant markup from the market value." I leveled her with an icy stare. "I'm well aware of the property's worth, but I'm not selling based on market estimates. I'm pricing it according to what I put into that place." The woman opened her mouth, perhaps to argue, but I silenced her with a raised hand. Every cent of that down payment came from my own earnings that my ex-husband continually belittled as playing pretend, not to mention all the mortgage payments and expenses I covered with my freelance income. Understanding dawned on her face as the pieces fell into place. "I see. So this is about principle," I stated flatly. "Ray thought he could lie, cheat, and steal from me with impunity. This sale proves him wrong and ensures I get my fair share of the profits from his shady investments." The realtor nodded slowly. "Well, when you put it that way, I'll list it at your asking price, Miss Shore. Just be prepared for a lengthier sale process." "Money's no issue," I assured her with a tight smile. "I can afford to wait for the right buyer to meet my terms." As she bustled off to handle the paperwork, I settled onto the couch, allowing my gaze to sweep over the all-too-familiar living room. For years, this place had represented my shattered dreams, a constant, looming reminder of how little control I'd had over my own life and finances. But now, a twisted sense of vindication coiled in my chest as I drank in the sight. This duplex, this monument to my suffering, was about to become the cornerstone of my renaissance. With Ray's duplicity fully exposed and our assets frozen, the sale proceeds from this property would be my defiantly claimed victory spoils. My hard-earned nest egg to secure a prosperous future for me and Benny, well beyond the reach of any other snake's grip. The thought made me swell with grim satisfaction. Ray's carefully constructed facade of success and loyalty was already beginning to crumble around him in the wake of the divorce proceedings. Just last week, I'd caught wind of his colleagues whispering about his sudden leave of absence from the firm. I could only imagine the indignities he was suffering. The confused clients, the speculative gossip, the utter humiliation of having his sordid misdeeds laid bare before his professional peers. And to think this was only the beginning of his hard-earned penance, a mere preview of the reckoning still to come. As for his parents, well, from what I'd heard through the grapevine, they were less than pleased with their prodigal son's transgressions. The schadenfreude I felt at their disappointment was admittedly petty, but no less savored for its pettiness. Let them wallow in Ray's disgrace, I decided with a twisted smirk. He was their shining example of manhood for so long, after all. Now he could serve as a cautionary tale of karmic justice. A muffled thump from the hallway jolted me from my reverie, announcing Benny's return home from day camp. A second later, his tousled head poked around the corner, cherubic face wreathed in an infectious grin. "Mommy, you'll never guess what I did today." As he launched into a breathless retelling of his latest adventures, I felt the roiling storm of bitterness within me ease, replaced by a surging wave of pure, giddy relief. This was it, the light at the end of the tunnel I'd been straining towards for so long. The promise of a fresh start, a second chance at building the life I deserved, all secured through my own resilience and determination. No more walking on eggshells, no more tolerating disrespect or dismissal. From here on out, I vowed silently, gathering Benny into a fierce embrace, we would write our own story on our terms. And this time, there would be no manipulative villains dictating the plot.